A few days before her birthday, Esperanza begged Miguel to drive her to the foothills before sunrise. There was something she wanted to do. She woke up in the dark and tiptoed from the cabin. They followed the dirt road that headed east and parked when they could go no farther. In the gray light, they could see a small footpath to a plateau. When they got to the top, Esperanza looked out over the valley. A cool, almost morning air filled her senses. Below, she could see the white roofs of the cabins in straight rows, the fields beginning to take form, and over the eastern mountains, a hopeful brightening. She bent over and touched the grass. It was cool, but dry. She lay down on her stomach and patted the ground next to her. Miguel, did you know that if you lie in the ground and stay very still, you could feel the earth's heart beating? He looked up at her skeptically. She patted the ground again. Then he lay down as she was, facing her. Will this happen soon, Esperanza? Aguántate tantito y la fruta caerá en tu mano. Wait a little while and the fruit will fall into your hand. He smiled and nodded. They were still. She watched Miguel watching her, and then she felt it, beginning softly, a gentle thumping, repeating itself, then stronger. She heard it too. Shoo, shoo, shoo. The earth's heartbeat, just like she had felt it that day with Papa. Miguel smiled, and she knew he felt it too. The sun peeked out over the rim of a distant ridge, bursting the dawn into the waiting fields. She felt its warmth washing over her and turned on her back and faced the sky, staring into the clouds now tinged with pink and orange. As the sun rose, Esperanza began to feel as if she rose with it, floating again like that day on the mountain when she first arrived in the valley. She closed her eyes and this time did not careen out of control. Instead, she glided above the earth, unafraid. She let herself be lifted into the sky, and she knew that she would not slip away. She knew that she would never lose Papa or a Rancho de las Rosas or Abuelita or Mama, no matter what happened. It was as Carmen, the egg woman, had said on the train. She had her family, a garden full of roses, her faith, and the memories of those who had gone before her. But now she had even more than that, and it carried her up as the wings of the phoenix. She soared with the anticipation of dreams she never knew she could have, of learning English, of supporting her family, of someday buying a tiny house. Miguel had been right about never giving up, and she had been right too, but rising above those who held them down. She hovered high above the sky at space and surrounded by the mountains. She swooped over Papa's rose blooms, buoyed by rose hips that remembered all the beauty they had seen. She waved at Isabel and Abuelita walking barefoot in the vineyards, wearing grapevine wreaths in their hair. She saw Mama sitting on a blanket, a cacophony of color that covered an acre in zigzag rows. She saw Martha and her mother walking in an almond grove holding hands. Then she flew over a river, a thrusting torrent that cut through the mountains, and there, in the middle of the wilderness, was a girl in a blue silk dress and a boy with his hair slicked down, eating mangoes on a stick, carved to look like exotic flowers, sitting on a grassy bank on the same side of the river. Esperanza reached for Miguel's hand and found it, and even though her mind was soaring to infinite possibilities, his touch held her heart to the earth. Here's this song that she's hearing. I don't know if you can hear it. Let's see. Okay, well, this is what she's hearing. On the morning of her birthday, Esperanza heard the voices coming from outside her window. She could pick out Miguel's, Alfonso's, and Juan's. She sat up in bed and listened, and smiled. Esperanza lifted the curtain. Isabel came over to her bed and looked out with her, clutching her doll. They both blew kisses to the men who sang the birthday song. Then Esperanza waved them inside, not to open gifts, but because she could already smell coffee coming from the kitchen. They gathered for breakfast. Mamá and Abuelita, Hortensia and Alfonso, Josefina and Juan, the babies, and Isabel, Irene, and Melina came too with their family, and Miguel. It wasn't exactly like the birthdays of her past, but it would soon be a celebration under the mulberry and chinaberry trees with newborn rosebuds from Papa's garden. Although there were no papayas, there was cantaloupe, lime, and coconut salad, and machaca burritos topped with lots of laughter and teasing. And at the end of the meal, Josefina brought out a flan de almendras, Esperanza's favorite, and they sang the birthday song to her. Isabel sat next to Abuelita at the wooden table. They each held crochet hooks and a skein of yarn. Now watch, Isabel. 10 stitches up to the top of the mountain. Abuelita demonstrated, and Isabel carefully copied her movements. The needle rocked awkwardly, and at the end of her beginning rows, Isabel held up her work to show Esperanza. Mine is all crooked. Esperanza smiled and reached over and gently pulled the yarn, unraveling the uneven stitches. Then she looked into Isabel's trusting eyes and said, "Do not ever be afraid to start over." And that's the end. There's an author's note. And she says, "I can see my grandmother crocheting blankets in zigzag rows." She made one for each of her 7 children, many of her 23 grandchildren. I am the eldest of the grandchildren. And for the great-grandchildren she lived to see. My grandmother, Esperanza Ortega, was the inspiration for this book. When I was a young girl, Grandma used to tell me what her life was like when she first came to the United States from Mexico. I had heard stories about the company farm camp where she lived and worked, and the lifelong friends she made there. When she talked about these people and how they had helped her through desperate, trying times, she sometimes cried at the memories. It wasn't until I had children of my own that my grandmother told me about her life in Mexico, about a fairy tale existence with servants, wealth, and grandeur, which had preceded her life in the company farm camp. I wrote down some of her recollections from her childhood. How I wish I had written down more before she died, because I could never stop wondering about her transition from Mexico to California and what it must have been like. Eventually, I started to imagine a story based on the girl who might have been her. This fictional story parallels her life in some ways. She was born and raised in Aguascalientes, Mexico. Her father was Sixto Ortega and her mother Ramona. They lived in El Rancho de la Trinidad, which I changed to El Rancho de las Rosas, and her uncles did hold prominent positions in the community. A series of circumstances, including her father's death, eventually forced my grandmother to immigrate to the United States to a company-owned farm labor camp in Arvin, California. Unlike Esperanza in the story, my grandmother had already married my grandfather, Jesus Munoz, when she immigrated to California. Like Miguel, he had been her father's mechanic. In the segregated Mexican camp with my grandmother, she lived much like the characters in the story. She washed her clothes in communal tubs, went to Jamaicas on Saturday nights, and cared for her first 3 daughters. That's where my mother, Esperanza Munoz, was born. During the early 1930s, there were many strikes in the California agricultural fields. Often growers evicted the strikers from their labor camps, forcing many to live together in makeshift refugee camps, sometimes on farms on the outskirts of towns. The growers were powerful and could sometimes influence local governments. In Kern County, sheriffs arrested picketers for obstructing traffic, even though the roads were deserted. In Kings County, one Mexican man was arrested for speaking to a crowd in Spanish. Sometimes the strikes failed, especially in areas that were flooded with people from states like Oklahoma, who were desperate for work at any wage. In other instances, the strong voices of many people changed some pitiful conditions. Mexican repatriation was very real and an often overlooked part of our history. In March of 1929, the federal government passed the Deportation Act that gave countries the power to send great numbers of Mexicans back to Mexico. Government officials thought that this would solve the unemployment associated with the Great Depression. It didn't. County officials in Los Angeles, California organized deportation trains, and the Immigration Bureau made sweeps in the San Fernando Valley and Los Angeles, arresting anyone who looked Mexican, regardless of whether or not they were citizens in the United States legally. Many of those sent to Mexico were native-born United States citizens who had never been to Mexico. The numbers of Mexicans deported during the so-called voluntary repatriation was greater than the Native American removals of the 19th century and greater than the Japanese American relocations during World War II. It was the largest involuntary migration in the United States up to that time. Between 1929 and 1935, at least 450,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were sent back to Mexico. Some historians think the numbers were closer to 1 million. Even though my grandmother lived in this country for over 50 years, I can still remember her breaking out in a nervous perspiration and trembling as her passport was checked at the border when we returned to the United States from a shopping trip in Tijuana. She also carried the fear that she could be sent back on a whim, even though repatriation had long been over. My father, Don Bell, came to California during the Dust Bowl from the Midwest and ironically worked for the same company firm where my mother was born. By that time, my grandmother had moved her family to a small house in Bakersfield at 1030 P Street. Mom and Dad weren't destined to meet quite yet. Dad was 12 years old when he picked potatoes during World War II with the diaper crew, who were children paid to pick the fields because of the great shortage of workers due to the war. He says the children weren't always the most diligent employees and admits he more often threw dirt clods at his friends than he picked potatoes. Later, when he was 16, he spent a summer working for the same farm, driving trucks back and forth from the fields and delivering workers. Much of our nation's produce comes from this one area in California. It is hot in the summer and cold in the winter. There are dust storms and tulle fog, and some people do contract valley fever. Before I got married, I took the required blood test in San Diego, where I had lived my college years. The doctor called because of an urgent finding in my lab results. I worried that something dramatic had been found until the doctor said, "You tested positive for valley fever." I let out a sigh of relief. I grew up seeing lugs of grapes on kitchen tables. I picked plums, peaches, apricots, nectarines, persimmons, almonds, walnuts, and pecans from backyard trees. Every year in August, I saw the grapes laid down on the ground to make raisins the same way they'd been made for generations. Lemons, tomatoes, or squash appeared on our doorstep from neighbors or my grandparents' gardens. I'd never been conscious of having any symptoms of valley fever. The only fever I recollected was my burning affection for my beginnings and belongings. Of course I tested positive, I told the doctor. I grew up in San Joaquin Valley. I knew that I had been naturally immunized to the actual disease by merely living there from the air I had breathed growing up. My family's feelings for the company camp are deep-rooted and still filled with loyalty for their start in this country, and for the jobs they had at the time when so many had none. Most of the people I interviewed who lived in the same camp with my grandmother held no grudges against the Oklahomans or others who competed for their jobs at that time. One man I interviewed said, "We were all so poor, the Okies, the Filipinos, they were poor too. We all knew the feeling of wanting to work and feed our families, and that is why it is so hard for so many of us to strike." When they asked about prejudice, I was told, sure, there was prejudice, horrible prejudice, but that's how things were then. Many struggled just to put food on the table and sometimes seemed to be resigned to the social issues of the time. They focused only on survival and put their hopes and dreams into their children's and grandchildren's futures. And that's what Grandma did. She survived. All of her children learned English, and so did she. Some of her children went to college. One became a professional athlete. Another a member of the United States Foreign Service. Others became secretaries, a writer, an accountant, and her grandchildren, newscasters, social workers, florists, teachers, film editors, lawyers, small business owners, and another writer, me. Her accomplishments were her accomplishments. She wished all the best for all of us and rarely looked back on the difficulties of her own life. It's no wonder that in Spanish, esperanza means hope.